Well, thanks again, everybody, for coming out virtually to check this out. I appreciate your time and attention. As we were talking about kind of in the lead up while we were waiting for everyone to get online and to join, I think, gosh, I've lost track now of how many times I've been out there with you guys, quite a few now. Seems like just about once every summer or so. But definitely eager to be back out at CNUG in person, hopefully next time. But still nice to see your faces in the little squares on my screen, better than nothing. And hopefully this information that I've got to share with everyone tonight is some useful information. I know a lot of people are kind of thinking about this right now. There seems to be a lot of energy behind this topic. So hopefully you find it useful. My name again is Jonathan Tower. I go by Jay for short. So if we get a chance to chat tonight or any other time, feel free to call me Jay. A little about me. I work for, I'm a founding partner and principal consultant of Trailhead Technology Partners. We're a software consulting company. We help our clients do custom application development. And that includes things like what we're going to talk about tonight, helping our clients take legacy applications that are in other technologies, like maybe .NET Framework, and bring them up to date and some more modern things like .NET Core and .NET 5. So if anything we talk about tonight is something that you're sort of working through or struggling through right now with you, with your project team or at your employer, these are things that Trailhead would be very willing to help with. So if you want to reach out, here's some of my contact info, both on social media and email. If we haven't met before, I'm also a Microsoft MVP in originally in ASP.NET and now in just .NET in general. Actually just got my 7th consecutive MVP award. So that's been quite an honor to have Microsoft recognize me that many times. And then also here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, just on the other side of the lake from most of you. I am the lead organizer for a conference called Beer City Code, which happens most summers. This summer and last summer, obviously, were a little bit of an exception, but we like to highlight both our microbrewery scene as well as our software coding community. So hopefully next summer, if you're interested in going to Beer City Code, you can check it out at beercitycode.com. Hopefully by the beginning of the year, January or so, we'll be announcing our plans for the dates for that again. And then the last thing I'll mention here on the slide is the GitHub link. If you want to get the slides or code for anything from tonight's talk, you can get it at my GitHub link here. Which if you're panicking, realizing I'm about to change the screen on you right now, don't worry, I'll show this again at the end also. All right, and of course, we can post that in the meetup group as well. All right, so a quick preview of what I'd like to talk about with you tonight about upgrading from .NET Framework to .NET 5. First of all, I want to just kind of do some quick definitions, talk about what is .NET Framework versus .NET Core versus .NET 5. Make sure we're all on the same page about all of those things, just so that the rest of the content has context to it. That would be pretty quick. Then we'll talk about maybe the first question you have is why would you want to upgrade? Maybe you haven't really felt much pain or suffering due to .NET Framework and you feel pretty happy with that right now. You might be asking, what's the upside to upgrading or what's pushing me in that direction? So we can talk about that, or maybe you feel that push yourself, but you're struggling for the words to, convince a boss or a client about that change. So we'll talk a little bit about why it's a great idea to upgrade to .NET 5. Want to then move on to talking about some of the different paths. There's a lot of different ways depending on your project and how it's set up. There's a lot of different ways to manage this migration. It doesn't have to be done all at once. You could do it all at once, or you could do it in stages. You could do pieces at a time. So we're going to kind of talk about those different approaches. And then when we do one of these migrations at Trailhead, we kind of think about it breaking up into these 8 basic steps. So I want to take you through those 8 basic steps for upgrading. And then along that way, I'm going to show you about 6 demos of some specific examples that you'll encounter when we are upgrading. All right, so this is a thing, if you've seen any of my talks before, you probably will remember that I like to do at all of my talks. Basically, I do these talks as just a way to give back. There's been a lot of people who've fed into my career and life over the years, and I like to share the things that I've learned with the community as a way to kind of pay back for that. And yet we're all sort of lucky because here we are in this fantastic industry where we're all paid fairly well and maybe even have some disposable income to do some fun things. There's just under about 1 billion people, maybe even a little worse these days during the pandemic, who don't have access to clean water. And that creates all kinds of problems related to poverty and disease that keep them sort of caught in that cycle. One of my favorite charities that's doing something about that is called Charity Water. You'll see they're rated really well on Charity Navigator. That's the type of thing that's important to engineers like me. They also have this really cool setup where they have donors that pay just for the administrative costs of Charity Water, so that when you and I give money to Charity Water, 100% of that goes to their water projects and none of it goes to their overhead. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, if there's anything you hear tonight that seems useful or interesting, or even funny maybe, if you want to give a little bit at this bit.ly link here, bit.ly/CNUG-2021. If you guys during this talk get it up to $200, then I'll put my money where my mouth is and donate another 200. So love to see that happen during the talk. If you need a reminder, I'll stop about halfway and give you a reminder of this URL, but it's bit.ly/CNUG-2021. All right, so we're gonna start out with some quick definitions. So what is .NET Framework versus .NET Core versus .NET 5? And then if you're paying attention to the news in our industry much, you may have even heard of .NET 6. So let's talk about those real quick. If you've been doing .NET development for very long, you may go as far back as me to 2000 or 2001, about 20 years ago, when .NET Framework first came out, version 1.0, and that's the version of .NET, or the flavor of .NET that we call .NET Framework. It's Windows only. It has some of the legacy application frameworks in it, like web forms or ASPX applications that have been around since the very beginning. And you can develop all kinds of stuff in this: WinForms, WPF, WCF, all kinds of great application frameworks that have been built over the last 20 years in this technology, but it is Windows only, and it is getting a bit long in the tooth. So about 5 or 6 years ago, Microsoft started creating something called .NET Core. And the idea of .NET Core was to basically rebuild .NET from scratch in a more modern way, with performance as a key feature and also with cross-platform as a key feature. So .NET Core is currently on version 5, which is what we're calling .NET 5. And and all of these versions run on Linux and Mac and Windows equally well. It's not like they kind of run on some of those things, like maybe in the past has been the case with things like Mono, where you can kind of get .NET to work other places, but it's not very well supported. It's not like that at all. .NET Core is a first-class citizen on Mac and Linux. So we have folks on our team that develop .NET primarily on Mac OS. We have applications that are running primarily on Linux, .NET applications that are running primarily on Linux servers. All of that stuff is very, very possible with .NET Core. And then finally, there's .NET 5, which is the most recent version of .NET Core. You may ask, why is the core dropped from that? Well, that's really one of these Microsoft branding things, but I think this diagram kind of helps explain it a little bit. So basically, from version 1 back in about 2000, we have .NET Framework starting out. That's gone through the 2 versions, the 3, and then the 4 versions. Most recently, version 4.8 is the most recent update to .NET Framework that came out just a little bit ago. And several years ago now, Microsoft started creating .NET Core. When it first came out, it certainly was not feature compatible with .NET Framework. There was pieces, in some cases, large pieces missing. It really kind of, you could say it launched with console applications and ASP.NET Core in it, and not a whole lot else. But in the years since then, more and more has gotten added to .NET Core. It's gone through 2 versions and 3 versions. And then with the most recent version back in November, Microsoft announced that it was no longer going to be called .NET Core because .NET Core has basically the future of .NET, and .NET Framework is kind of at its end of life. It's going to continue to be supported for years. There'll be security patches and those types of things, but there is going to be no new major version of .NET Framework. So all the energy in .NET has moved over to .NET Core. And for that reason, basically .NET Core is just .NET, or is all of .NET now going forward. And so kind of rebranded it to just .NET. And because Core was on version 3 and Framework was on version 4, they decided to go with a nice clear number of 5 so that there was no confusion between, if they had picked .NET 4, it would have been super confusing with .NET Framework 4.8. So they just picked 5 to avoid all of that. So you may be asking yourself this question, why would I want to bother to do all this work to get my application into .NET Core or .NET 5? You may have a boss who's asking you these questions, or like in my case, a lot of times a client who's saying, is it worth it? So let's talk a little bit about some of the main reasons that you would want to consider upgrading to .NET 5. The most important one, in my opinion, is performance. As I mentioned, when .NET Core was rewritten from scratch, version of .NET, performance was taken into account from the very beginning and from the ground up. So performance is a first-class citizen. Microsoft likes to say performance is a feature in .NET Core and now .NET 5. And I find that to be really true. I think if you take the same application and compile it into .NET 5 or a later version of .NET Core, you'll find that it functions a bit better, both with memory and with processor performance. And what's great is, like, I've seen some of the previews of some of the features that Microsoft's been working on for .NET 6, which will be coming out this November. And it looks like performance is still a massive focus of their development effort. .NET 6 is going to be an even bigger upgrade than .NET 5. And I think a lot of the reasons that's going to be is because of all the massive performance upgrades that they're putting in it. So performance is pretty huge. It's being actively developed. I mentioned on that last slide that .NET 5 and on are the future of .NET. If you're still on Framework, well, it's going to be there. I think the support licensing is going to go at least 10 years, and it's included as part of the support for Windows. So we know that's not going to just disappear overnight, but any new exciting features being developed in there, no. Anything cutting edge, performance improvements, anything like that going to be included in .NET Framework? No. Going forward, all of that stuff happens in .NET Core, .NET 5. Also, easier future upgrades. Obviously, at some point, you're going to have to upgrade your application. Maybe 10, 15 years from now, .NET Framework is maybe not supported anymore, who knows? But if that happens, then now you don't really have a choice whether you upgrade your application if you want it to be supported. So obviously, keeping it a little bit more modern helps you with those future upgrades. But another great example, or another great reason to upgrade, is the cross-platform ability. I had a client years ago that really wanted to be able to do .NET development and hire .NET developers for their team, but their main product was hosted on a router, which was run on top of a Linux distribution. And at the time, it was not straightforward or supported to run .NET applications on Linux. Mono did exist, but it was kind of iffy. And so they didn't feel comfortable with that, and they ended up kind of having to use other technologies that they could run on Linux at the time. And now I think of them often like I kind of would love to go back to them at some point and say, hey, look, you can actually do this now. You can write ASP.NET applications on Windows or on a Mac, and you can deploy them to a Linux distribution running on a router device and have those applications run and function. So that's kind of cool. Obviously, also there's the development time story. So like my team, I know we have a mix of people who prefer Mac OS and people who prefer Windows. If you have that type of setup on your team, you can also have those people equally well be able to develop .NET applications regardless of their OS of preference for development. .NET Core and 5, Microsoft has done a lot of work to make projects load and build faster. So that's really nice. If you're looking to do any kind of cloud native or any of the sort of cutting edge cloud things with .NET, all of that is happening with .NET Core and .NET 5. Really nothing is supporting .NET Framework for that anymore. And not to say you can't run .NET Framework in the cloud, but if you do, you're not going to be doing some of the cloud native technologies that Microsoft is putting a lot of attention and energy into. Also, it's open source. This still, I run into people who are surprised finding out that Microsoft's .NET is open source and on GitHub, but it definitely is. If you want to watch the .NET team developing .NET, adding features, fixing bugs, you can watch it happen in real time on GitHub. You can see pull requests coming in from the community. You can see issues being tracked there. You can see roadmaps for what they're planning. It's all happening in the open, and it is contributed to by the community. So it is truly an open source project. In fact, it's one of the biggest open source projects in the world these days, which is pretty cool. The command line interface in .NET Core and .NET 5 is first-class citizen created, .NET Core was built around this command line interface, which means that anything you can do in Visual Studio to build, create projects, create packages, download packages, all of that stuff is totally accessible through the command line interface, which makes testing, automation, CI/CD, all of that stuff a lot easier to do because of that great command line interface. It also helps you attract and retain top developers. We all know that the best engineers like to do the cool new stuff. And if you're supporting, a legacy .NET Framework application from 15, 20 years ago, that's probably not the cool new stuff anymore. And it gets harder to keep people excited about that. And so if you want the best folks on your team, it's also really great to have some of the cool new stuff that you're doing. All right, so hopefully that provides you enough ideas that you can give that feedback to whoever might ask you about why you would want to upgrade to .NET 5. Let's talk a little bit about upgrade paths. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to think about this, and it totally depends on your particular project and all of its components. But just in a general sense, you can think of anything that's in .NET Framework that you want to take up to .NET Core. That's going to be where the pretty heavy lift is. That's where the most amount of effort is. If you already have a code base in .NET Core and you want to move it up to .NET 5, that's typically going to be less effort, quite a bit less, in fact. If you're in .NET Core 3.1, for example, which is the last version of .NET Core before it became .NET 5, that's going to be a very small or insignificant change to get your code up to .NET 5. But if you're in Framework 4.8, that number, it's funny because that number 4.8 sounds like it's a lot closer to 5. But ironically, if it's in Framework anything, it's going to be a heavier lift to get it up into .NET 5. So just kind of a quick warning up front, you should plan on any effort that you're going to do to upgrade your project, especially any kind of large or complicated project, is probably going to be some effort to get kind of over all of those versions of .NET Core and catch it all the way up to .NET 5. You're looking at, 5 or 6 steps of version evolution. That's pretty major. So we found that different types of projects are easier and other types of projects are harder. And so I kind of created this list showing what projects we think of as the easiest, the sort of medium hard, and then the hardest or even impossible projects to upgrade. So the types of work that we do, we use a lot of class libraries for code reuse. And class libraries are, the great news is those are typically the easiest to upgrade. So we're going to look at an example of that in a minute. WinForms and WPF, those can be pretty easy to upgrade actually. As of the last 2 versions of .NET Core and .NET 5, you can move those over from .NET Framework to .NET 5 now. And for the most part, you'll find a lot of stuff just recompiles. The places you'll run into some trouble with these types of projects is if you're hitting any .NET APIs that are only Windows specific. There is a trick to fix some of those that may be missing in .NET 5, and I'll show you that in a little bit. The other trick you might run into with WPF and WinForms is if you're using a particularly old class library, maybe third-party class library like a components library, or maybe even a really old NuGet package that hasn't been updated in years. Those types of things, you could run into a thing where you may have to replace that with something new because it may not actually be available or may not have ever been compiled by its publisher to run against .NET 5. Those are kind of the only things you'll run into with those, but typically it's fairly smooth. And then if you have an ASP.NET project running on .NET Framework that is predominantly an API, we find those to be the easiest of the web projects. And I think the main reason is because the web front-end technologies since 15, 20 years ago have changed the most. You know, we have things now like Angular, Vue, and React, TypeScript, Webpack, Node.js. These are all things that kind of came along that are now part of modern front-end web development that didn't really exist in the early days of ASP.NET. And as a result, we find that the web front-end components are a bit harder. So once you get all the way up to number 4 here, MVC projects, if you have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you need to bundle and combine and stuff like that, you can upgrade those things. I'll show you how to do that, but that will be a little bit more work. Now, if you're looking at ASPX projects or WebForms projects, if you haven't heard already, I hate to break the news to you, but those are not moving into .NET 5. In fact, Microsoft has indicated several times that they have no intention of ever bringing WebForms forward. So if you have a WebForms application, you have a couple of choices. You can replace it with something more modern. If you like the WebForms paradigm, then Blazor or possibly Razor pages are things that you might consider looking at in ASP.NET that might feel somewhat similar, but there really is no straight upgrade path. That would be a significant rewrite type of situation. The other thing is that WCF services currently are not supported. WCF clients do exist in .NET 5, but not services. Really, Microsoft wants you to move to something more modern, like gRPC or obviously REST APIs with JSON through like a web API type of application. Okay, so let's talk about partial upgrades. Imagine you have this scenario where you have an ASP.NET application running on .NET Framework, and you have 3 or more class libraries that are also compiled against .NET Framework. Now you want to start bringing this code up into something more modern, but maybe it's going to be quite a bit of effort. So you want to know how you might do this in pieces. So if you start with just these class libraries, you can actually just recompile them against .NET Standard. Now, I'm trying to remember, I think I actually a couple of years ago, I did a .NET Standard talk for this group. I know not all of you were probably there, but if you're not familiar with it, .NET Standard is not yet another flavor of .NET. It's actually just, as the name suggests, a standard for .NET. So if you have Mono and you have Xamarin and you have .NET Framework and .NET Core and now .NET 5, these are all different flavors of .NET. And the .NET Standard basically says, hey, look, if you want to reuse code between all these different flavors of .NET, put it in a class library, compile it against the .NET Standard, and then it'll be portable between all those different flavors of .NET. So basically, just take your class library, recompile it against .NET Standard. Now you can re-reference it from your ASP.NET. You notice I haven't upgraded this from .NET Framework yet. So now I've got essentially no change. Like my code, my .NET Framework web application is still running my class libraries and running them all in .NET Framework. But now those libraries are .NET Standard, which means they could also run in .NET Core. So now I have the option of creating maybe a new ASP.NET Core application running against .NET 5, and also referencing those 3 class libraries and using them in that new application as well. So now I've kind of brought my my application logic, at least whatever is in those class libraries, forward and brought it into a more modern technology with a fairly small lift. You could even think about maybe there's some way to combine these 2 applications so that they feel like one to the user. Maybe they are integrated somehow visually, or their security model, tokens, et cetera, are all integrated. And so you can gradually start moving functionality from the old application into the new application until you've eventually moved everything, and maybe give yourself a year, or something like that. And then you can retire this ASP.NET against .NET Framework project. So that's one way to think about partial upgrades. Some things to keep in mind: there are many ways to accomplish these partial upgrades. I just gave you that one example because it's one that we run into pretty frequently. We often find ourselves starting with the class libraries. You certainly can be creative when it comes to subdividing things. That example I just gave of kind of creating a virtual application out of those 2 web applications and making them integrated together a little bit, that's a creative solution that helps you slowly migrate your code to something more modern. And definitely think about upgrading in phases. If you have a large application, it can be hard to set aside the year or 2 or whatever it takes to rewrite the whole thing all at once. And of course, by the time you do, there'll be like 1 or 2 new versions of .NET at that point. So it's better to kind of do these things in phases and then keep keep the waves coming. Okay, so that is everything I wanted to talk about doing them as partial upgrades. Let's talk about the 8 steps that we think about when we're upgrading at Trailhead, when we're upgrading these projects. Before I do that, though, I should mention the bit.ly link. So if you've joined us since the beginning, love to have you go to this bit.ly link if there's anything useful that you hear tonight, and donate a little money to Charity Water to get some clean water for folks all around the world. You can go to bit.ly/CNUG-2021. If you guys get to $200 by the end, then I will also do $200. All right, first step. When you are going to do one of these upgrades, it can be helpful to start with a step that gives you some information about what you need to do. And the best tool for that is something called the .NET Portability Analyzer. This is a Visual Studio extension that you can install right in your Visual Studio. And then it'll actually analyze your code for you. You can tell it which platforms you want to analyze the code against, and it'll tell you how big of a lift that's going to be to upgrade your code from what it is now to what you're wanting it to target. Just as you kind of look at the results of this, you'll see that any hundreds basically mean it's going to be 100% automatic. Anything less than that means it's going to be some amount of work for you. So the higher the number here, the closer it is to 100, the better news it is for you, because the more automatic or simple your upgrade is going to be. So let's do a quick demo of the Portability Analyzer. But before we get into that too deeply, I want to also show you guys this sample project that we're going to be looking at tonight. So just a quick overview of that. Right now you can see there's 3 projects in here. There's a class library. In this class library, there's a few really fancy methods doing some complicated math. You can see one of them is adding, another one is subtracting. We've also got a multiply and a divide. So some simple integer math there. And then I do have another method that just gets the names of famous mathematicians. And you can see it's parsing it from JSON actually, which I'm just doing to kind of make this look and feel more like a real API that I'm calling. But that's kind of what's going on in my class library here. In my web application, maybe it's easiest to actually just show you the web application. So let me set that as a startup project and we'll just launch it real quick here. So running this web application locally, it should look familiar to you if you've been doing .NET for very long. This will be the very similar to the new project template when you create a new ASP.NET .NET Framework application. There's a few pages here. If I go to the About page, you can see it just says the application's on version 0.1. If I go to the Contact page, there's some hard-coded stuff in here. If I go to the Math page, this is where the real cool stuff happens. I can add, subtract, multiply, or divide numbers here using my math library that I wrote. And finally, on the Data tab, it actually makes a call back to get the list of mathematicians that we just looked at. So that's kind of my application, my web application, just creating a front end for some of those classes that we just looked at on the back end. And then similarly, I created a WinForms application as an API. So if I set this as my startup project, this one's a lot simpler. It's just a couple of text boxes, and here I'll do a different one this time. And you can see it's just using my add method from my math class and adding these 2 numbers together. So that's the amazing sample application that I wrote for you guys tonight. Now let's look at what is being targeted by these projects right now. So you can see this library is targeting Framework 4.8, the web project, also Framework 4.8, and the WinForms project, yet again, Framework 4.8. So these are all running on the most recent version of .NET Framework. All right, so now if I want to do the portability analyzer, I can start by going here and adding the extension from the extensions library, but I've already done that. So now all I need to do is come down here and click on either the project or solution, and you'll see there's this Analyze Assembly Portability option. There's also a Portability Analyzer Settings, which I want to look at real quick first. This has got a few things in it, including where the output is going to go to. But what I'm really interested in is which target platforms are checked. These are basically all the platforms I'm going to tell it that I want it to check. So I want it to check .NET Core 2.0 and 3.1. I want it to check, of course, .NET 5 because that's the most recent one. For Framework, I'm going to have it check Framework 4.8. I can have it check different versions of .NET Standard for my class libraries. I do, in fact, have it checking 2.0. And if we're doing web projects, we can also have it check different ASP.NET Core versions and so on. So I'm going to just leave the settings the way they are and run the portability analyzer here. You'll see it'll pop up a little tool here, and that opens right up in Excel. So let me make these columns a little bigger so we can see what these target .NET versions are. So this first row here, this is my class library. You can see my class library, which is currently written in 4.8. If I was to move it to 4.8, it's saying that it's 95.45% compatible. So that's kind of funny. It's for some reason not 100% compatible with itself, but obviously we know it is. It also is showing me that if I wanted to move it, it's a class library, so it would be a .NET standard that I would upgrade it to. If I moved it to 2.0, it's actually telling me, oh, that's 100% compatible. So that's going to be a real easy upgrade, automatic, in fact. So that's exciting to me because I'm a developer. I like not working if I can get away with it. And then for the WinForms one, you can see it's on 4.8 currently. If I look at upgrading that to .NET 5, I can see that, oh, great, that one is also 100%. So that one is also going to be automatic and very easy to do. Now let's look at the web project. This is always the tricky one. So web project, never as easy. You can see these numbers don't really go over the mid 70s at all. But if I wanted to upgrade this to .NET 5.0, you can see it's saying it's about 70%. What that means to me from my experience is that based on that, I'm probably not going to try and upgrade it automatically because it's probably going to create more of a mess than it is going to be helpful. Now, I certainly encourage you, if you have a code base that's in Git or something where you can revert it to play around with the tools that I'm going to show you tonight that will do it automatically. There is a way to get it to give you a jump start on your web project. But I find after doing it a few times that doing the web projects manually is actually easier for me. Great, so now I have kind of a head start on from this portability analyzer on what I'm facing and what my best options are for upgrading these things and how much work it's going to be. So let's talk about the second step, which is to evaluate your project dependencies. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, I mean what we just did here, where we looked at each of the projects that I have that I may consider upgrading. We looked at what version of .NET they're currently targeting. We looked at what the upgrades to different versions would look like. The other thing we didn't do is actually looking at the references between them. So if I look at my WinForms applications, I can see that it references my class library. Obviously, my web application does as well. So kind of understanding that graph of relationships between the projects will be helpful too, to know which ones to do first, which ones could happen later. So after I've analyzed that, it's good to think about what versions I'm going to make everything target. So if it's an actual application like ASP.NET, console application, WinForms, WinForms, WPF, any of those actual applications, then I need to target either .NET Framework, some version of .NET Core, or .NET 5. If it's a class library, I have a few choices. I can actually target .NET Framework, which may be the case for your legacy code already. I can target .NET 5 for that class library, but then it will only be able to be referenced by an application running .NET 5. So for my class libraries, it's often going to make the most sense for me to upgrade them to .NET Standard, which, as you can see here in this graph, any application, whether it's Framework, Core, or 5, is able to reference a .NET Standard class library. So that's going to make the most sense unless I'm upgrading everything all at once, all the way to .NET 5, in which case I could probably just move those class libraries all the way up to .NET 5 instead. Now, if you're a bit confused about the whole .NET Standard thing, this documentation right here on the .NET website can be very helpful. There's actually a link there to an interactive table that you can mess around with and see based on what versions of and what flavors of .NET you're trying to support, to see what versions of .NET Standard will give you the best support for all of those flavors. And the lower number you go with, the more platforms you'll get. The higher number of .NET Standard you go with, the more APIs or API surface area from .NET based class libraries you'll get. So that's kind of your balancing act. I think you'll find a lot of times that .NET Standard 2.0 is kind of your go-to. That's probably the most common one to use these days. So you can check this link out and that'll help you kind of figure out which version of .NET Standard to use. if you decide to do that. Okay, so that brings us to step 3, which is converting our class libraries. So now we've kind of done all the planning stages. Now it's time to actually start doing the work. So there's this great command line tool that you can install called try-convert that helps you do some of these, some of the automatic parts of these conversions. You can install it using the .NET command line. It has a tool command, and you can install a new tool, -G for globally, and then the name try-convert. Now I've already done this, so I already have this installed. So the next thing I'm going to do is basically run this command to try to convert a project to a particular target framework. So let's start with our class libraries. And I'm going to go here to this one and open that directory in the terminal. Okay, now with that open in the terminal, I'm going to do my try convert, and I'm going to tell it I want it to convert this project to, this is a class library, so I'm going to convert it to .NET Standard 2.0, which you may remember from the portability analyzer, it said would work 100%. So you see Visual Studio wants to reload that project. I'll let it do that. You can also see that the conversion completed successfully. Now, if I go in here and go to the property pane for this, you can see my class library is now upgraded to .NET Standard 2.0. Furthermore, if I look at my Git client, let me see. Yeah, let me save those changes. There we go. If I look at my Git client, we can see that basically what happened here is it created a backup copy of my csproj file called csproj.old, and it changed the project format to a more modern .NET 5 compatible project format. You can certainly do this manually if you feel comfortable editing this XML. But as you can see, it's a fairly complicated change. The new project files are quite a bit simpler than the old ones, but they are XML. If you get anything wrong, it won't work. So it is kind of nice to use this tool to do it for you automatically. And what's cool about it is it even upgraded all of my project references so that everything's still pointing to that project file. So if I look at, if I like build this stuff here, you'll see that it actually rebuilds my class library as a .NET Standard 2, and then it's rebuilding my web and WinForms applications still as .NET Framework, but now referencing this .NET Standard class library, DLL. So pretty cool how that just works for me automatically. And now you've seen a little bit of how it might look to upgrade that. Now, obviously in your project, you might encounter a few problems. You might have some NuGet packages that don't exist anymore, or some other kind of incompatibilities. And you'll just have to basically solve those, test, recompile, etc., until you kind of get all of those things worked out. But in general, the class libraries are quite a bit easier. Okay, so now let's talk about what it looks like to convert WinForms and WPF. Like I mentioned earlier, these are almost as easy as a class library. The thing you're going to run into here, more likely, is that there are a few APIs you might be using in WinForms or WPF that are Windows specific, especially if you're doing anything like Win32 calls or anything like that. Those are not going to be supported. Some of that stuff is supported by a NuGet package called the Microsoft.Windows.Compatibility. If you go find that, you're going to find that some of the classes and namespaces and stuff that when you first try and convert your WinForms application or your WPF application to .NET 5, if you get some errors about those things being missing, you'll find adding this NuGet package will just make a lot of them reappear. And if anything doesn't reappear at that point, that's again going to have to be something that you manually replace with something different and fix yourself, or rewrite that component or that piece of your application yourself. But this compatibility NuGet package can be very useful. Now again, with try convert, we can try to convert a WinForms or WPF application. So I'm going to do that here by going in to my WinForms application and opening it up in the terminal. And I'm going to do try convert. Now this time, this is an application, not a class library. So my target framework is going to be .NET 5.0 instead of a version of .NET Standard this time. And once again, Visual Studio detected the project file change, wanted to reload it. You can see the conversion was complete. And if I go look at the property pane for this, you can see now my WinForms application is on .NET 5 as well. And in fact, if I run it again, just like that, I have a working .NET Framework, what was a .NET Framework application in WinForms running now on .NET 5 instead. And you can see it still functions correctly. So again, yours probably won't be quite that smooth, but whatever issues you encounter, you just solve them one at a time until you've got everything fixed, and then your application is up and running again. Surprisingly small number of issues usually come up. All right, now let's get to the big one. So if you've been following ASP.NET Core at all for the last 5 or 6 years, you probably already know that ASP.NET Core is pretty different in some important ways than ASP.NET. There's a lot of similarities, controller classes, obviously C# classes of any kind. Entity framework still exists, although that does have some changes as well. But a lot about how ASP.NET works under the covers. A lot of things like the configuration, the dependency injection, the request and response pipeline and how that's handled. A lot of that stuff has been rewritten from scratch in ASP.NET Core. So if you upgrade your application using try convert, your web application, you'll actually have, if it's a web application, you'll have to actually use this force web conversion tag. And if you don't use that, it will warn you that it's not going to do it because it's a web application. So that tells you a little bit about how likely this is to work for you very well. It will give you a jump start, and so I do encourage you to give it a try if you can revert things safely. But I do find that for me, doing this manually tends to be a little easier for me. So let's talk a little bit about the manual process that I would usually go through, and I'll show you some examples as we go. So the first step is to create a new ASP.NET 5 .NET 5 project. So I've already done this just to save us a little time here. Here's another copy of that same solution. You can see the only difference here is I've created a Web 2 application. This is my .NET Core, ASP.NET Core running against .NET 5. So if I look at the property pane for this, you see it's compiling against .NET 5. And then my Web 1, or my main web project here, is still my .NET Framework 4.8, just so you see what I've got to start with there. So start out, just create a new placeholder project for it. Next step is to think about your startup. So in startup currently in my application, I have, that happens in the global asax.cs file. This file does not exist in ASP.NET Core. And so anything that's happening in here, I'm going to have to do somewhere else. Now, it just so happens that a bunch of these things aren't something I care about at all. Most of these things here I can skip. But this last one, which is creating bundles from my JavaScript and CSS files, if I look at what's going on in here, you can see it's creating some bundles out of my various JavaScript and style sheet files. And I do need to do something to create those same bundles. So I do need to replace that functionality somehow. And in ASP.NET Core, I don't have global ASAX, but I do have something called the startup CS. And here in my startup file, you'll see I've created an extension method called add CSS and JS bundles, which if we look at what's going on in here, you'll see it's using an extension method that comes from something called Web Optimizer. Now, Web Optimizer is not a Microsoft library, but it is Microsoft recommended. If you actually go to the ASP.NET Core docs page on Microsoft and look up how to do bundling and minification, one of the options it'll give you, and really the only one it'll give you that does server-side bundling, is to use the Web Optimizer library. So I'm doing that here, and you can see I'm basically bundling the same files together into the same bundles that I had before in my old application. And that's being called from my startup class, which is what I have for handling startup events in ASP.NET Core. All right, so next step after I thought about my startup is copying over my existing controllers and classes. I have done that already to save myself a little time. If you look here, I have controllers under my old project. I have one API controller and 3 MVC controllers. And that's really it as far as CS files. I don't have any other classes in here because it's a pretty simple project. But in the new one, I also have those same things. Now, if I compare one of these, I want to show you that there are a few differences. So take, for example, the data controller. In the new one, you can see that's inheriting from controller, which is an MVC in the MVC namespace. In the old class, it's inheriting controller, which is from the system.web.mvc, as opposed to Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC. So that's one kind of difference, is that other than that, you can see the classes are identical. There's really no obvious differences other than my using statement changes, so that controller class is being used from a different namespace. So that's a pretty simple change. And now let's look at the API controller. The old API controller, you can see it's inheriting from a base class called API controller. And this one actually comes from the system web HTTP namespace. And if I look at my new one, this is actually inheriting from something called controller, which comes from the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC namespace. That's the same one we saw for the MVC controllers in the new application. And that is definitely the case. That's one of the differences with ASP.NET Core, is that the controller base class is combined between API controllers and MVC controllers. And what you use instead is this attribute here to mark your controller for the compiler as being an API controller. And then it will use different binding settings that make more sense for an API controller. And if you don't supply that, then it will use all the bindings the way that makes the most sense for an MVC view controller. So that's just something to be aware of. Other than that, very few changes. I've just marked up one of my methods with an HTTP GET endpoint. But other than that, everything else is the same. And that kind of completes that step. So we've copied over those classes and fixed those issues to get it to compile and run again. Next step, handling content files and bundles. We kind of looked at that already, so I'll gloss over that one a little if you don't mind. And we did talk also about these controllers and how they need to inherit from the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC controller. And then you want to use the API controller attribute on your web API controllers. Now, this is the point where you would run into any kind of NuGet or reference errors with any class libraries you're referencing from third parties or from NuGet packages. I think you'll find that the majority of the things that you may have been using in the past will actually have new versions. So as an example, I upgraded this project from the Microsoft new ASP.NET project template from framework 4.8, and everything moved forward to NuGet packages that are available still today for .NET 5. So if that upgrades, then probably a lot of yours will upgrade as well. And if there is anything missing, you just have to be aware that you need to find a different NuGet package that does the same thing, or maybe rewrite some of the components of your application to replace the things that are not compatible with .NET 5, should those exist. Finally, you got to fix up any of your using statements or changed namespaces. If you do have any custom handlers in your ASP.NET code, which isn't super common, but anything that manipulates the request or response outside of the controller, those are called HTTP handlers in ASP.NET. Those don't exist in that form anymore. There's now something called .NET middleware, and you want to basically do that in middleware. And if you just Google .NET middleware, you can see it's very simple to do. In fact, in the interest of time, I won't show you tonight, but I do have an example of some middleware in this code base. If you download it later and you're interested in that, you can look at that middleware. And the next thing you want to think about is your configuration. So in the past, we used the web config file for app settings and connection strings. That's not available to us anymore. There is no web config file. That's an IIS specific thing. And since ASP.NET Core needs to be able to run anywhere, not just behind IIS on Windows, we need to put those settings into a different file. The default name for that new file in ASP.NET Core is called appsettings.json. So let's look real quick at what that looks like. So in my old application, in the web config file, you can see I've got an app version setting here in app settings, and then I've got a DB connection string in my connection strings. And you'll notice in the new project, I don't have any web config file, but I do have this app settings JSON. And this is just custom JSON that you can create in any form you prefer. And I've created a couple of properties in here, one called connection strings and one called app settings. And each of those has a property for DB and for app version. Now to map that into your code, you also need to do that in the startup class. And so right here in the startup class, I can say, I want to use the configuration section called connection strings, and I want to use the section called app settings, and I want to map those into these objects. So I've got one called connection string, which is just a string called DB, and I've got one called app settings, which has a string called app version. So you can see those map exactly to the app settings that I have in my JSON file. And by mapping those like that, I can now inject those using dependency injection anywhere in my application, and those settings will be available to me. So for example, if I go to the home controller, you can see an example here where on the constructor for the home controller, as one of the parameters for the constructor, I'm injecting an iOptions of app settings. That value is then being captured here into this app settings field. And then I can use that app settings property or object anywhere in my controller class. I'm using it here to output the app version onto the page. And you can see I've used that to replace this line of code that was using the configuration manager to get that out of the web config file. So that's kind of what it looks like to upgrade your configuration settings. The next step we want to think about is cleaning up any of the unused files. So now we don't need the global ASAX or ASAXCS file. We probably don't need any app config files. If our project was using the old-fashioned NuGet packages.config file, we don't need that anymore because that's been moved into the project file at this point. Especially if you use try-convert, that should do that for you automatically. So now you can delete all those unused files. And so then at that point, you're just fixing errors and replacing code with code that works in .NET Framework until you get everything working the way you want. So as you can see, much harder with an ASP.NET project than with class libraries or WinForms or WPF because of all of those changes between ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core. All right, so we already looked at this demo here. Let's talk now about some of the things that you need to be aware of when you're upgrading to EF6 from Entity Framework 6 to Entity Framework Core 5, which would be the version you'd be using if you upgraded to .NET 5. So first of all, I'll just say that this can get complicated, especially if you're not super comfortable with SQL. But I will also say that most of it will just work. Now, some things definitely won't work. Keep that in mind. When I say most things will work, I mean most, not all. If you have a large application, especially, you're going to have a certain percentage of things, which in a large application could be a large number of things that are not going to work the way you want. The thing I want to really stress the most about this is that when you upgrade from EF6 to EF Core 5, that it's really important to inspect the SQL and to do some performance testing. And what I mean by that is even some of the things that work still continue to work functionally may not actually work in a performance under some load. And so for that reason, there's a few different ways you can inspect the SQL. You can output that into the console while you're debugging. You can log it on the server, and you can also use some debugging tools that you can install into your application. And any of those options basically give you a way of seeing what SQL is actually getting executed when you execute your Entity Framework query. And that's going to be really important to catch any of these things where the query doesn't convert to SQL the same as how you expect it to. The other way you're going to catch those things is by creating some performance tests. This can be actually really helpful to do before you start the conversion. So set up some performance tests so you get some benchmarks. Anything that gets significantly worse, especially under load, is very likely something that didn't convert to use the same SQL as what it was using before in EF6. So those are kind of your prime candidates to check first. Some of the things you're likely to run into, one of the more likely ones is something called a Cartesian explosion. So if I give you the example, if you have an order and order detail table, and you do a dot include, you're querying against the order table, and you do a dot include to bring in the order details. In EF6, it's very likely to have done those two as separate queries. Select star from orders where blah, 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 and select star from order details where blah, 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 and then combine them in memory. In EF Core, it's just as likely that it will not do that, but will decide to do it as what's called a Cartesian explosion, which basically means it's going to do it as a single table of results. Now imagine that you have an order table where there's a lot of columns, and maybe your typical order has quite a few order details on it. If you explode the order and order details out so that you're pulling back the order detail for each order detail on an order, you're pulling back all of that order's columns repeated over and over again. If there's a lot of columns there and if there's a lot of order details for each order, you're going to potentially be pulling back quite a bit of data that's just repetitive data that you don't need. Entity Framework Core has a great extension method that you can use to solve this problem. If you wanted to explicitly split those queries and to do it as two separate queries, you can do the extension method as split query, and it will do those include separately. So again, that's best to find those things by actually looking at the SQL that's being generated and to compare the performance to what you had before. Another situation that can come up is when you have complex group bys. Those can sometimes just silently happen in memory on EF Core. What I mean by in memory is that instead of happening as a group by in your SQL statement, it'll actually just bring a ton of stuff back into memory into your .NET application and then do the group by in memory there. Now, that's not a big deal if you're talking about 10 records, but if you're talking about 10,000, especially if you have hundreds or thousands of users doing that at the same time, that can be a pretty bad performance situation. So what's really tricky about this is that this can happen silently to you, which again brings me back to my first point, which is inspect your SQL. set up performance tests. This is the best way to catch these things when they're happening, especially if you have a large application and you don't have time to go check everything at this level of detail. The trick to kind of get around this is to flatten your data. So if you get your data into a flat like table or a more linear format, then you can do the grouping often and it will move back into SQL. But again, you only really know that that's happening if you're inspecting your SQL. Then also I'll just mention that the Fluent API for mapping between entities and the database, some of that has changed. Some of the naming conventions of that has changed. So if you have some of that code, you'll find that you need to do some just global find and replaces to replace some of those names with the new names. And then the last thing, hopefully nobody's using lazy loading. In almost all of my talks, I talk about how entity framework lazy loading is a bad idea 99% of the time. But if for some reason your legacy code has lazy loading, just be aware that in EF core, lazy loading is turned off by default, which I think is a much better default. But if you're counting on it, you need to turn it back on globally. Otherwise, you will be missing that. And then all that to, to hit that one more time about inspecting your SQL and doing performance testing, make sure that at the end of this process, that all of your queries are hit somehow with some full regression testing to make sure that they're all working after the migration. I did mention before, and I showed you one example with the iOptions interface of the dependency injection framework that's built into ASP.NET Core. If you're using a third-party dependency injection framework, chances are you can still continue to use that. You can search on the Microsoft Docs and see which ones are supporting the ASP.NET Core dependency injection framework. All the major ones, almost all the major ones are. The one kind of big exception that I am aware of for that is Ninject. If you're a big Ninject fan, I'm sorry to tell you that particular product hasn't been updated really to support ASP.NET Core. There are some community efforts to do that. And as I've checked it over the years, it has been sort of spotty. So my recommendation is if you have a DI framework you're already using that you like, and it is supported in ASP.NET Core, then go ahead and just keep using it. If you're not using DI, or if you're using Ninject or something that's not supported, then use the ASP.NET built-in one because it's pretty great for 99% of people. All right, I'm going to skip that so I have a little time to talk about this. So I just do want to mention that the default JSON serialization and deserialization class, which we're probably all familiar with, Newtonsoft, or also known as JSON.NET. That's been kind of the default until somewhat recently. .NET Core, I think 3 or right around that time frame, they switched it over to system.text.json, which has better performance generally than Newtonsoft JSON does. So if you're looking to serialize a lot of JSON or big complicated JSON, this will be faster for you than Newtonsoft is. Though, since the changeover to that, I have noticed that the Newtonsoft team has put some more effort into speeding up Newtonsoft. So I think there's a little bit of an arms race there to see who can make theirs the fastest. And maybe we're getting to the point where it's closer again. But at least when it first came out, the system text JSON was definitely faster. But do be aware that they are very much not feature compatible. There's a lot of stuff that Newtonsoft or JSON.NET has that the system text JSON library does not. So if you're upgrading an application that's already using JSON.NET, I recommend you continue to use that because otherwise you are going to run into quite a few incompatibilities. If you're doing anything new and you're concerned about performance, or if you have time to do some full regression testing on your serialized JSON, then by all means use the system text JSON. But some of the things, just as an example, that are missing from that, the one that bothers me the most is the reference loop handling. So if you've got an object tree that has a circular reference in it, Newtonsoft will actually detect that and say, oh, hey, I've already serialized this object. What do you want me to do? You can tell, there's a few settings you can give it to tell it what to do in that circumstance. When it comes to system text JSON, that is not an option. It just errors. So definitely something, if you're using Entity Framework and serializing that to JSON, that you want to be aware of. Okay, so we talked about all of these things and we looked at some demos, and hopefully, I haven't checked yet, but hopefully you all have been to this bit.ly link and given $200 so far so that you can cost me some money. But that brings us to the part where you get to ask some questions. So do we normally just have people unmute and ask questions here?
Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead and unmute.
Perfect.
So I've got a question that's kind of, we're in this situation where we were using WCF and also Windows Workflow, which kind of has given our group the idea that we're stuck on .NET 4.8. Is there any, like, I don't know if it's, because we probably can't go down to the standard in the library either, as I would imagine. So I don't know if there's any ideas like out of process type translation. Like, I don't know even where to start with that. Have you run across anything like that?
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember which of those two projects it is, but I know there's a community-led effort with at least one of those and maybe both of those to move that library into like an open source community-led project. And I can't remember.
Yeah, I knew Workflow had something like that.
Yeah.
But then I guess the other recommendation I've seen is gRPC instead of WCF.
Right. Yeah, I think WCF this is just my read on it. So, don't put too much weight on this. This isn't like me speaking on behalf of Microsoft or anything, but I get the impression that WCF is unlikely to get a lot of love in the future because there's so much better options today. And the other thing about Windows Workflow is that there are now Azure services that do essentially Windows Workflow. Maybe somebody can remind me what the names of those services are. I haven't used them a lot myself, but I think that's the one that actually has the community-led GitHub-based project where you can get some compatibility with it. But yeah, WCF, I think you're likely to need to upgrade that. Now, keep in mind, WCF services can't be upgraded, but the WCF client already has been rewritten. So if you have anything that's consuming WCF that you want to rewrite or upgrade, you may actually be able to do that.
This is Mandeep. Just want to quickly share some thoughts on WCF. So Microsoft is already backing gRPS. So it's extremely unlikely that they are going to migrate WCF. I mean, extremely, extremely unlikely. So gRPC is the official recommendation. Microsoft even have a free ebook. Like if you go to microsoft.com/net/architecture, there are a bunch of books there.
Yeah, but I know sometimes you get a lot invested into a technology like that, and it's even if you don't love it, it's hard to upgrade. But boy, once you've done REST APIs or gRPC, you realize how awful WCF is and why they're not trying to bring it forward.
True.
So I don't know if that helps, Mark. I know it doesn't make it easy for you either way, but
no, I mean that's kind of what I've come to conclude anyways. I know I've started using gRPC for some unrelated stuff. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's the logical transition. It's just a matter of, I can't just turn on a switch one day and have it work, right? I mean, it's
a
large
project work to do.
Point.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, you could always hire a consulting firm like Trailhead, right?
Nice.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, of course. Anybody else have any other questions?
Yes, I have one question. Jay, thanks for the talk again. I saw you gave the manual migration kind of recommendation. I was thinking maybe it could be a hybrid approach. Like one could use these tools, so then whatever is the leftover could be manually rewritten. So just wanted to get your opinion. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's very much worth trying it and
Yeah.
spending some time exploring what it did. I think if nothing else, it will help you learn what the differences between ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core are, and some of the ways that the try-convert tool went about doing the upgrade. It doesn't, so far, I haven't used the try-convert on a web project where I've kept the work that it did without just redoing the work that it did. The one thing that is kind of nice is the actual project file and the NuGet references. If you have a really big, complicated project file with a lot of NuGet references, that can be a bit painful to do manually, and the try-convert does handle that well. So yeah, some sort of hybrid approach probably makes some sense. Just keep in mind that even if you luck out and it's as easy as possible with a web project, you're still going to have a lot of manual work. So I always like to understand what I'm doing, and maybe that's the reason why I sort of veer towards manual in that case, because I know that so much of it is going to have to be manual. I want to understand where everything ended up. But yeah, a hybrid approach could very well make sense.
Okay, so a kind of follow-up, maybe a question. So let's say, we are sitting with the client, there is a debate. What should we do? Like a complete rewrite or like a migration with a tool? So maybe the first starting point could be run the analyzer and find out where do we stand. And then maybe, take the call, depends upon the complexity. I mean, I have seen some solutions have like, even one of my clients, they have 185 projects in that solution.
Yeah. Yep, that's going to be a big effort no matter what you do. Even if you just need to click on each project in the Solution Explorer 185 times, that's going to take a while, right?
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, definitely. I encourage, if you're going to do this, I encourage you to start with the analyzer. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's going to give you some just basic information about how hard the effort's going to be. Gives you also a good idea of like what versions you're likely to be able to use to upgrade to. And then if you do have some web projects, I recommend trying to use the try-convert and just see, maybe set aside a day or two or a week or something, depending on how big the project is, to experiment and see how close you can get it to working. If you spend a week on it and you're further away at the end of the week than you were at the beginning, that might be a good indicator that it's not going to be worth the time. But yeah, you kind of, every project is so different. You do have to kind of try it a little bit and see how it goes and how much of a lift there's going to be.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Got 185 projects. Might also be time to think about, are there big enough other changes going on too that would, move you forward architecturally, but also give an opportunity to move like only pieces at a time, right?
Yeah, good thought.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. Yeah, like microservices would be, when I see 185 projects, I often think there's very few problems in the world that require 185 projects to solve them. So there's some questionable architecture possibly going on there, right?
Well, I've been there where I started on a project that already had a lot, and in order to do something to avoid a circular dependency, you had to create yet another project. And
right.
It tends to create this sprawl
Just for the context, my client have all their source code within that solution. So
everything they ever wrote all in one solution.
Yes, everything there.
it's a silly, simple thing, but another thing that we often see, clients just don't think sometimes that they can split their like behemoth solution up into separate solutions, even if the solutions don't directly reference each other. Maybe they only reference each other through HTTP calls or something like that, through REST services or whatever. Those could all be separate, split up into separate solution files too, right?
True. I proposed. Their reason was it's easy to browse and see. I'm like, okay, we'll see.
What's their inner loop like though? Because 185 projects doesn't build in 10 seconds.
That's right. So then what I do, I have a folder just for my code. Then I click on that folder and select build. So that saves me a lot of time.
Yeah. One kind of cool feature, I don't know if anyone's explored this at all in the current version of Visual Studio, is you can do solution filters. So it's kind of like creating a solution with different combinations of projects in it. But you can basically filter out, you can open up the solution, but only open certain ones, certain projects that are in that. So that's another thing you could play around with. If they don't want to remove everything from the solution, you could maybe at least filter some of them so that you're not having to load them. Even just getting Visual Studio to load 185 projects is not fast. So that I feel like their explanation is a little dubious about seeing it all in one place. But
true. And you might have seen the video of Visual Studio 2022. They are highly promoting that if you have a lot of projects, it is really efficient because of the space. It's 64-bit compatible. So they are really promoting that feature. So looks like Microsoft knows people are doing it.
They do, yeah. They have all the analytics from Visual Studio. I've been in the room when they were talking about that in Redmond, and it's definitely something they're aware of. However, I think this is a good opportunity to push back a little bit on your client and say, just because you can and just because it'll be faster soon doesn't mean it's a good idea.
True.
Yeah, great questions.
Hey Jay, I know you mentioned, class libraries, a good way to do partial upgrades is to target .NET Standard. And I noticed you mentioned .NET Standard 2.0, 2.1.
Yes.
So I wanted to know what was the reason behind that. And the other thing was that I had read somewhere where since .NET 5, where the progression happened from .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5, the whole concept of .NET Standard is kind of being dropped as well. So is that something that's going to be compatible now that we're coming close to .NET 6? That's if this is a part of the migration path, is there like a end of life to this as well that we should be aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's no definitive answer to that, but if you think about it this way, at some point, I know Microsoft is going to cut it off and say, look, if you're doing .NET, maybe it's not .NET 6, maybe it's 7 or 8 or something, but somewhere in there, they're going to say, if you're trying to run your application in .NET 8 and you're trying to reference code that's also being shared with a .NET Framework application, it's been enough years now that we don't care about that anymore. I feel like it's probably not going to happen super quickly because, like, look at the situation we're all in right now. We've got this, legacy .NET Framework code, and it's going to take some time to get rid of that code. And if you can move class libraries into .NET Standard and continue to reference it in more modern versions of .NET, like when 6 comes out, that's going to be pretty important for a while until you can get rid of that legacy code that's referencing it. So I don't think you're going to see it disappear. Then again, Microsoft has surprised me before. But I pulled up this, I linked it earlier in my talk, but there's this grid here that you can check out. There's also this interactive version that's linked down here. which I find to be quite helpful. So if you look at the different versions of .NET Standard, you can see what it allows you to target. So if you're looking at like .NET 5 applications and .NET Framework all the way back to 4.6.1, those can all target .NET Standard 2.0. If I move that up to 2.1, you can see now that .NET Core and .NET 5, 3.0 through 5.0 can reference that, but .NET Framework can't reference it at all. So that's why I talked about 2.0 being probably the most common. The reason is it kind of is that sweet spot between it has a lot of APIs in it that you're probably needing. Most NuGet packages are compiled against .NET Standard 2.0. So you're going to have a lot of compatibility there, but it still maintains compatibility with .NET Framework, at least back to 4.6.1. Yeah, so that's where this this interactive thing can come in quite helpful to understand. You know, why don't we just use 2.1? Well, it's because you lose .NET Framework there.
I see.
Yep,
it's good to know. Another question I had was with regards to, I think it's more specifically ASP.NET projects. Would you say that like web config transformation files are another one of those things that you would need to kind of rethink into using those environments and app settings and environment variables and whatnot?
Totally, yeah. So for those who don't know what he's talking about, I have a very simplistic project here, but in this project, I have an app settings JSON file. It's not uncommon to also have things like this, where you have app settings.development.json, app settings.production.json, you know, that type of thing for each environment. And then to basically have different settings for each environment in there. It's even maybe more advisable to also have certain secrets that you don't put into any of those files, connection strings, passwords, tokens that you're using for, you know, API authentication or whatever. Those types of secrets that you don't really want to have in your code base, because if it gets compromised, then someone has access to a lot more. Those things actually go pretty well as settings on your CI/CD release pipelines. Basically, if you're using Azure DevOps, for example, you have a release pipeline, you can very easily put a setting in there that just matches the name of a setting you're trying to set. Like, for example, connection strings.db, I could put as a variable on my release in Azure DevOps, and it's going to find this setting based on that name and replace the value of it with the value that's stored in there. So my connection string doesn't have to be stored in a JSON file. But yeah, those types of things you definitely will have to think about. Where's that stuff going to go? What's the process? You know, what's the best place to put these things? How is it different on different environments? That's definitely another thing you'll have to think about when you're moving your configuration settings.